Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman is all set to present Union Budget 2022-23 on February 1st. This will be the 10th budget presented by the Narendra Modi-led BJP government since its appointment in 2014. The budget assumes importance as it is being announced at a time when the country is battling the third wave of COVID-19. While the ease of restrictions, while with the ease of restrictions, the economy was reviving and getting back on the growth trajectory, it remains to be seen whether the recent spike in COVID cases and modest restrictions, at least as of now, cause any impact on the economy. In this edition of Big Picture, we will analyze the expectations from Budget 2022. Let's look at this from a perspective of the policy level direction that we can expect in the budget. Where do you see the focus or the impetus?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would agree with the earlier panelists, Ajay Shankarji and Shubhamoy, when they talk about the fiscal deficit and the monetary policy, the tightrope walking that the government has to do. And I think they've done a pretty good job so far. And so we've also had the World Bank projecting our growth to continue at 8.3% in the coming fiscal too. And with the pandemic shocks not really impacting so much because of the high rate of vaccinations that we have managed to get traction on in the country, I think that is going to be, that is actually, help the multilaterals to actually give a good projection for India's economic growth. So I think pandemics is something that we're going to be living with, and we'll be able to maneuver our manufacturing activities around the pandemic, and we've learned to live with it with the kind of preventive measures that one needs to take in terms of the PPE kits and all of that. So that's one about the pandemic. But in terms of policy, I think it would be a continuation of the last year's policy largely, because there was a lot of infrastructure thrust on in last year's budget. And I think that has to go forward. As Shubhamoy just mentioned, public investment is the key to drive growth now coming forward, because the private sector is still going to be a little in the shell and not going to be coming out unless public investments come out largely. And also there are a lot of incentives for the private sector to invest. So I think that should be the theme, perhaps, to incentivize larger private sector investments by continuing the pace of public sector investments, especially in infrastructure sector. I think that needs to be, the outlay on infrastructure needs to have at least a 25% growth if we want to achieve the targets of the national infrastructure pipeline. So there has to be a thrust on infrastructure, as well as, of course, various other wish list activities, which perhaps in the second round I could elaborate on.
I'm not even going to the municipal level. Yeah.
Vineeta Hariharan, what other sectors do you see focus as far as this budget is concerned?
Yeah, just to add to what Shubhamoy just mentioned about state spending, that's something that I have seen at close quarters when I go on field visits to various states to see the implementation of centrally sponsored schemes. There's a huge allocation, as we have seen last year, by the central government towards various programs which is to be implemented by the states. So where the flaw is seen is that these centrally sponsored schemes are actually routed through the state governments. And unfortunately, I mean, that's the way it has to be, because the states have to implement, but that's also where the lacuna lies in, because the states are not able to give in their state share. There's something called a state share which has to be plowed into the all the centrally sponsored schemes, be it Manrega, be it any of the national flagship programs. So the state share takes a lot of time to come in from the treasury, and therefore the last mile transfer of benefits is if there's a huge lag. So that's a big gap. So in order to, I wish we could have, there was a proposal mooted, I think a year back, on having Niti Aayog kind of agencies in every state, where these agencies would actually coordinate with various state departments and see to it that the centrally sponsored schemes, at least the budget flow and the policy intent of these centrally sponsored schemes are intact and it's implemented effectively. So that's one announcement that probably the center should consider. And the second would be, of course, we've all seen how the banks have been so overburdened by these centrally sponsored schemes and the subsidies that they have to root out through various programs that have been trusted on them, so to speak. So I think it's time we disengage or disentangle the banks from subsidy flow and look at, we have high hopes in the Ministry of Cooperation. I wish we could have a huge budget announcement done through Ministry of Cooperation, and if we could get them more activated on the ground and see the cooperatives, the cooperative banks actually playing a larger role in implementation of schemes and last mile, effective transfer of schemes to the beneficiaries. I think that's the second point. And the third point would be, speaking about for my own gender, I think we have not seen a lot of social sector spending except on health. Education and gender spending, we've gone a bit low. Our gender budgeting is only around 18%, whereas the developed economies have about 57 to 58% for gender budget. So I think that's something we look forward to increasing. Something like a PLI scheme, if there is a productivity linked incentive given to industries and corporates for hiring of more women professionals and to increase the labor force participation of women. I think that's something that we need to look forward to. And of course, infrastructure spending, I think that is something that again has to go in the momentum that it was announced last year. And we would like to see more announcements from the finance minister on what happened to the NAPFID and whether the equity spending that was announced has actually gone to NAPFID. And we'll also look at creative sources of innovative sources of revenue for the state and the central government, like municipal bonds and more innovative options for revenue resource generation, especially for the state and the municipal levels.
Absolutely. Close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Yeah, sure. So taking forward from what the panelists said earlier, so I think we'll have to look at innovative sources of income and also look at how we could actually incentivize private sector investments, keeping the pace of the public sector investment as it was last year, and incentivize private sector, also probably look at some kind of an appellate authority or a board for a fund where the NRI investments could be channelized for various investments in the country. So I think that is something that could work well. And look at innovative sources of encouraging innovative sources of revenue generation at the state, at the subnational, and at the municipal levels. I think that is something that we can look forward to, and perhaps look at looking at giving equity support to MSMEs now, because this is a very long-term demand from the MSMEs. They've been burdened with the credit inflow, but they've taken it well. But I think the MSMEs which have had a past previous good track record could also be considered for giving equity infusion now.
Absolutely. All right. We'll have to leave it at that. Thank you so much to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us.